This is Bob Ferris, Executive Advocate with Murphy Business, and welcome to the fourth in our series on lean turnarounds. This is on redraw. Redraw is what happens after you've developed emergent insights from either design or reflection or both and modified your original canvas. It also happens once you take that modified canvas into the world and find out that you need to change or pivot it. So you come back and do a redraw. And I'd like to discuss the fact that these pivots can have patterns. Now, what will happen in a lean process, whether it's lean startup or lean turnaround, is that you're going to first try to establish profitability. So you take your new canvas out there, you try to find customers that like the value, and then you got to try to find out if those people will actually pay for the value. If they won't, which is very typical, you go back, and that motion of going back and changing we call a pivot. Patterns were introduced in business model generation. They are examples of architectures of business models that follow the same general structure. So here is a freemium pattern from business model generation, and it's one we've seen before. This is what Checkster.com uses. There's a free basic service that generates a large base of free users, and then rather than develop an independent channel to go out and sell services, that experience is the channel to sell premium services. Now, in Business Model U, we have an example that was actually contributed by Richard Gadberry of the same company I work with, Murphy Business, called the computer technician. Now, what happened here was a young man wanted to leave corporate America and have his own business. Since he was a computer technician, his thought was, hey, my new business should have computer values. How about finding me a retail computer store to buy? Well, on the surface, that sounds like a good idea, but you are not just your skills. You're also your interests and your personality. And as we look at this gentleman's interests and personalities, he really wasn't the kind of person that would be successful in retailing. So what we did was we pivoted this idea and we said, let's focus on the fact you're a technician. Let's find a business whose value is technical. And what we did was we found him a small business involved in supporting measuring equipment using weights and scales and measures and so forth. And he's done very well there. To categorize these pivots, I want to go back to the regions of the business model that we've discussed before. Over on the left, we've called that the resource region. And this region you control more than anything else. The right-hand side is the market region, and the market does what the market wants to do. You have no control over that. And in the center, you want to create emergent values. Now, those values you don't control, but you influence, you help create them in what you do, so they're sort of semi-controlled. Now, if we wanted to create a pivot, a change between two of these regions, the areas where we would have the most control and therefore most likely be able to succeed is here, between the controlled and semi-controlled. And I'm calling that kind of change an A pivot. Now, the next area we might go to would be between still control, we want to hang on to that, and the uncontrolled, which we'll call a B pivot. And finally, the pivots that have the highest amount of unknown in them is directly relating values and market, and those are C pivots. And while they have the highest risk, they have by far the highest return. So let's go back and let's take a look at examples of an A pivot. The one we saw with the computer technician was an example of an A pivot. Probably the first pivot anyone using business models ever experiences is an A pivot. The first time we look at a business model and we try to figure out what is the value provided by our current or our previous organization, we tend to answer that by saying what we were doing for the customer. And what we were doing for the customer really isn't the value, that was our key activity. And so we end up with this pivot, and that motion kind of reminded me of an abstract letter A. Also, there's an A in key activities, and I started calling this very first pivot an A pivot. So we'll see an example of that also in Business Model U. This is the doctoral student. Her value was improving article readability and style. And her customers were university professors who were trying to publish academic articles. And if you look down at the costs, there's a problem here. She had stress due to extra research required. Now, academic articles have to be cited. You have to say where the ideas you're discussing originally came from. And it takes time to find those citations, and that really doesn't improve the article readability and style. So she really wasn't getting paid for that work, but nonetheless, she was having to do it because of the nature of the customer's job to be done. Now, if you take a look at this, improving article readability and style, her value provided, is just rewording, editing and rewriting, okay? It's the same thing. And so this is really an A pivot of the kind we talked about. That leaves a hole. What value was she really providing her customers? What she was doing was she was helping them get published, okay? And that includes doing the research required for the citations. So when she approached her customers based on helping them get published and saying, here's all the things you have to do, here are my charges, she can now charge bigger fees because she gets paid for doing the citation research. And that, okay, didn't make the time go away to do the research, but since she was getting paid for it, it's no longer a stress. And in fact, the extra money helped pay for some additional marketing that she could do. Perfect example of how an A pivot works for an individual. Now let's twist that and let's talk about, could this work with an organization? We have said a lot that you are a resource, and it consists of your interests, skills, and personalities, plus those things that you own. Does an organization have things analogous to interest, skills, and personality? Well, they certainly have an interest. I mean, they have a marketing focus in their skills, their ability to manufacture the values that they sell. How about personality? Well, in the case of Harley-Davidson, Michael Kami felt that the Harley brand was a personality. And in fact, he could do an A pivot, all right, and take that personality, which was their brand experience, okay, and make a value which would create revenues from it. So yes, organizations can do A pivots. Now, C pivots, which involve this area over here on the right-hand side, working between customer relationship, customers, and channels, are the really big ideas. These are the game changers that you've talk about in business model generation. And in fact, if we want to take a look at where we get good A and C pivot examples, you'll find Business Model U seems to have a lot of A pivot examples. business model generation tends to have a lot of C pivot examples. So this idea of a freemium, this is a pivot. Okay, we're actually, instead of having a sales channel, we're doing what for years salespeople have called a puppy dog close. This went back to pet shop owners when they would see someone walk in and just play with a dog in the shop. They would come up and say, well, look, why don't you, no obligation, just take the doggy home and see what you think. And of course, if you take a puppy home, especially if you have kids, you just bought yourself a dog. Now, internet services aren't puppies, okay? You're not going to be as successful as a pet shop owner, but the idea is, yeah, if you take it home, if you get to use a basic service, there's going to be some percentage of those users that are going to actually fork over the money for the premium service. And so we've pivoted there on the right-hand side by taking and making part of the value for free. This leads us to the B pivot. You'll notice we went right from A to C. Now the B pivots are very important, but they're somewhat problematic. The reason is, if you look, doing a B pivot does not involve creating value. And what we need to do, if we're going to be taking a lean startup approach, or if we're going to be taking what I'm calling a lean turnaround or reinvention approach, okay, we want to first make sure that we have established significant value. So while the B pivots are there and they're important, initially we don't want to do them, okay? They get in the way. But where do B pivots become important? Well, that's going to be the topic of our next session.